Hello, am I on? Is this microphone working? I'm not entirely sure. If anything is... it is working this time. Okay, second time's a charm. Okay, well, good morning, maybe, unless you're watching this at night. We are talking today. I want to basically talk about two things in this video. I don't want it to be too long, hopefully about 20 minutes or so. And then make another video for today's class as well about Christianity. Okay, so today we're going to talk about, I'm going a little bit out of chronological order because I want to talk about Judaism and then Christianity. So we're going to talk about ancient Greece right now, ancient Greek thought. So we'll begin here with, these are kind of big, broad ideas. Ancient Greece, civilization as far as, was around for a long time. But you're talking about when it was kind of thriving was around 500 years or so before Christ. Okay, so I can maybe write in 500 BC, just a general date. You guys probably know from history classes in middle school, Greece was a democracy. And in what we're doing in talking about worldviews and religion and these huge ideas that shape civilizations, this is certainly an idea that has shaped civilizations and shaped people's thoughts to this day. Right? Athens had this idea that people could decide what their city was going to do. And it was a city-state. It was just the city, but, we're going to go to war. People voted on it. It wasn't everybody. It was people who were citizens, who had property, who were men. So there was definitely restrictions, but it was very different than the rest of the world, which had basically a situation where, there was a king and they're in charge. A little while later, Rome really kind of undergoes the same thing. It's actually around the year 500 that Rome has kind of a revolution and throws off a king and has a republic. And a republic means that it's a government without a king. So similar kind of thing. It's a different system. They had representatives called the Senate that decided things. But in general, when you talk about Athens and Rome, you're talking about two places in the ancient world that even hundreds of years before Christ, this is when there's huge empires like the Persian Empire ruling so much of the world. These places are saying, hey, we're going to do things differently. We're not going to have one person in charge. We're going to have the people rule. And so these are really important ideas that come out of the ancient world. Other important ideas is we have Greek philosophy. What I said here in that line, I said philosophy provided better answers than paganism. Now, not all Greek philosophy provided great answers, and this is a very basic understanding of it right here, but it certainly was a better kind of answer to life's big questions. Where did we come from? What's the point? What's a good life? What does it mean to be a good person? And worshiping Zeus just didn't do that for people. And so, it's in ancient Greek, ancient Athens, that people like Socrates come along. And Socrates, what makes Socrates so significant, I have Socrates / Plato there, but I'll explain that in a second. But what makes Socrates so significant is that he went around asking those kinds of questions. And from everything we know about him, this is about 300 years before Christ, Socrates went around saying things like, so what would a just society look like? Or what does it mean to be a good person? He asked a famous question of, if you could get away with anything, if you could be invisible and never be caught for anything, would you have moral obligations to still do good things? Wow, these are good questions. Is there something bigger that should dictate how you behave, how you live? Socrates, most of these questions and answers and dialogues were written down by Plato. So the reason we know about Socrates mostly, not totally, but mostly, is from Plato. And what Plato taught was, sorry about all the noise, I don't know if you can hear it, but something's crashing upstairs. What Plato taught was kind of what Socrates was saying. So Plato's books are all basically Socrates asking questions and that kind of thing. Okay, so sorry, I had to pause it for a second there. Something crashing in upstairs, down the stairs. Anyway, so Socrates and Plato. So what we know from Socrates was, he was going around asking these philosophical questions, and then Plato really wrote about that. And so we can't really separate the two very much. They were two different people for sure, but their ideas, Socrates' ideas are all kind of Plato's ideas because Plato is the one who wrote about Socrates. But when people study this, they kind of talk about how Plato really focused on like universals, like what is goodness, what is justice, how should society be? These kind of big questions. He thought philosophy could kind of thinking about these things with your mind, and your mind could kind of unlock the mysteries of life, and the human beings could do that through thinking. Philosophy. Philosophy means the love of wisdom in Greek. So that's what I mean by the universals, those kind of big issues. Aristotle was actually a student of Plato, so they all kind of go together. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they all, one knew the other. Aristotle was a student of Plato, just like Plato was a student of Socrates. And Aristotle wrote lots of books on philosophy, dealing with similar questions, but Aristotle is very much concerned with what people now call the particulars, as in, let's study kind of like, not necessarily the big thing, but when it comes to, let's say, ethics and right and wrong, okay, rather than asking these big questions about what is a good man, let's think about like what actions does a good man do. Let's think specifically about kind of like good things and bad things to do. So it's much more practical. Aristotle has a huge, I'm going to write it in there, a huge emphasis on logic, on thinking, and if you think the right way, you will arrive at the right answers. Now, this is way too basic. We do not have time to get into really the ideas that these people had. The important thing, I think, for you guys to note is their ideas were important. Their ideas, the fact that they were asking these questions, the fact that they were trying to arrive at answers about what life is all about, what is goodness, all these kinds of things, these shape future civilizations. They shape our world today. And so, as far as worldview is concerned, ancient Greece and Rome, because Rome borrowed so much from Greece, these things still influence our world today. Their ideas about government, their ideas about philosophy, influence our world today. And the last thing to say about ancient Greece, one of the things that makes it so important historically is that it didn't stay in Greece. Greek culture did not stay there. It spread. Aristotle's student, a guy named Alexander the Great. You guys probably know about Alexander the Great, but Alexander the Great had this ambition to conquer the world. And he conquered just about all the world that they knew. He conquered up into India and Egypt and, parts of Europe as well. Massive, all through Persia. He conquered the Persian Empire. Massive empire gained by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, when he conquers, his goal and his successor's goal was to spread Greek culture. So all throughout the world that Alexander conquered, people started speaking Greek. Now, not everyone. If you look at the Bible, okay, Jesus, from what we know, Jesus didn't speak in Greek. He probably knew Greek, but he didn't speak any. He taught in Aramaic. But when the Bible gets written down, it gets written down in Greek, because that was the language that was most common for most people. Okay, so you could, write something in Jerusalem and then send it to Corinth, and or you can send it to Egypt, or you can send it to, who knows else, well, Spain, and it was in Greek, and everyone would understand it. And that's hundreds of years after Alexander the Great, about 300 years after Alexander the Great, that the Greek was still prominent. And the point of all this is that there was the spread of Greek culture, of Greek thought, and so people all over the world heard about things like Athenian democracy, heard about things like Plato and Aristotle. Okay, and so even thousands of miles away. Okay, so it certainly is one of these ancient Greek culture, certainly one of these things that impacts world history on a massive scale. Okay, there are 3 monotheistic religions. You must know, be able to name them: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So we're going to talk about Judaism in this thing. We're going to talk about Christianity later on today. I'm going to make another video today. And then we're going to talk about Islam on Wednesday. Wednesday will be, we will do a chapter on Wednesday, and it won't be jumping around. It'll be a chapter. It'll be chapter 10, the one on Islam. Okay, so let's talk about Judaism a little bit. You may know Judaism as the religion of the Jews. It draws from the Old Testament, and this is kind of basic, probably. Now, it's not, modern day Judaism isn't totally like what is talked about in the Old Testament, because the temple no longer exists, and there's other things going on. But as far as in the Old Testament, God reveals Himself to Abraham and to His people, and the God that we find in Judaism is a universal God. God is not the God of like the sea, like in paganism, or the harvest, or these other kind of things. God is portrayed in the Old Testament as He is the God of all creation. And that's a big difference. So Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament and New Testament, but the God of the Jews, as He reveals Himself, He's like, I'm the Lord of all things, not just this one place. So pagan gods were typically localized. They were typically over specific things. The God of the sky, the God of the sea. Yahweh is the God of all. And so that's a big difference between Judaism and the religions around it. Okay, so I switched locations to avoid some noise. My children are watching Little Mermaid, and Ariel's getting loud. Anyway, okay, so God is the universal God. He chooses a people. I'm going to give you a timeline in a second, but you need to know Abraham. God calls Abraham. God gives His law to Moses. So that's kind of the fundamental ideas of Judaism, is that God has chosen the Jews to kind of show who He is to them, and to have this special people for Himself. Christians understand that God chose the Jews, yes, to have a special people for Himself, but that those people would be His way to bring His Savior into the world and to save the entire world. Okay, so we understand that, yes, God called the Jews and God has a chosen people, but it was for a different reason than Jews usually would talk about. I want to make an emphasis on this. Judaism rejects paganism and idolatry. I want you to think about the Jews. I want you to think about the Bible in its historical context. This is the ancient world. This is, ancient Canaanite areas, ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon. The area that the Bible takes place in, and people all around them did things like worship idols. The Jews did not have any idols. They did not have those statues. People all around them engaged in pagan practices. And we think about that, and we don't really think very much about what that means. But when you talk about paganism, and I put examples here, and I want you to note some of these things, right? In the ancient world, paganism often involved things like ritual, cutting, and other forms of physical abuse on worshippers. This was common. Paganism often involved that, like mutilation, self-mutilation. Paganism, the worship of these false gods involved that. It involved often, and this is awful and gross, but it involved things like child sacrifice. In the Old Testament, God says many times, do not offer your children to Molech. Why? Because everyone around them offered children to the god Molech. It was common, and it persisted. Even later on, when Solomon marries some pagan wives, he engages in that practice. It's absolutely terrible. So mutilation, child sacrifice, and then another thing, which is very freaky. There were what we call like ritual prostitution. There were temples of pagan gods where women were basically sold into those temples, and they would kind of be prostitutes for worshippers. And those gods were worshipped through having sex with prostitutes. Okay, I'm trying to put this mildly and all the rest, but I want you to understand that paganism in the ancient world was absolutely wicked. And we just think, oh, they're worshiping other gods. No, like there's a lot to worshiping other gods that we don't even think about. Now, but if you understand the historical context, and if you read the Bible and pay attention, you'll see, oh my, things are pretty rough there. Okay, God, on the other hand, the God of the Old Testament, is holy, and he expects his people to be holy. He is good to people. He is just. He expects that. And so the law is a lot of times revealing who he is and his character. A lot of the law, I will say this, a lot of the Old Testament law, the Torah, in that next line, is about being different from the world around them. So sometimes that's very much in the moral sense, like, don't offer your children as sacrifices, or, has rules about who you can sleep with, as in like you only can have sex with your spouse. But other parts of the law were very much about the society as being different, like don't eat pigs, because all the pagans do. So there's a lot of laws that say, we're just going to be a very different people than the world around us. And the Torah is really all about that. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. It's also known as the Pentateuch. Once the Jews were exiled, and we'll talk about that briefly later, and spread all over the world, you started seeing synagogues come up. Synagogues aren't really in the Old Testament, but they are in the New Testament, because it's kind of after that period where Jews are spread out all over the place that they can't all go worship in the temple, and so they have synagogues to where they'll read the law and learn the law of God and pray and hear preaching and things like that and sing the Psalms. Today Judaism is very much tied to Jewish culture. So it's just very much a religion and a culture. And so, the term Jew is used to mean someone who's ethnically Jewish, whose parents are Jewish, who's culturally Jewish, and who's religiously Jewish. They use the term, we all kind of use the term, to mean any of those things or all of those things kind of all at the same time. So someone could be Jewish and, not really even believe in God. But it's just kind of expected that there be some basic Judaism as well as cultural Jewishness. Okay, this is the last slide for this video. I want to give you this very basic timeline of the Bible, and I think this is really helpful. I do this in a lot of classes. I remember hearing it one time, and it really helped me. So just to kind of understand, this is all in 500-year increments. Understand the timeline of the Bible. Around 2,000 years before Christ, God called Abraham and said, I'm going to make you a great nation, and your descendants will bless all nations. That's in Genesis 12. Okay, so God calls Abraham. That really is where the Bible story begins. The other things are kind of, before then is kind of like the prologue, setting it up, and then God calls Abraham. Bible story begins. Around 500 years later, this is probably the most indefinite date. We're not exactly sure, but around 500 years later is Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. God leads his people out of Egypt, out of slavery, into the Promised Land. Moses gives them the law, the Torah. And they, this great revelation of who God is, his character, his goodness, his justice, what he expects from his people to be like him. Around 500 years after that, after settling the land and fighting over it and doing not so great of a job, settling it, around 1000 is King David. And King David is the second king, but also basically the greatest. His son Solomon in some ways was greater, but not greater when it came to his faithfulness to God. And so David is kind of the king that all kings are compared to. And even David is flawed. We know that. The Bible doesn't pretend that he's perfect. But God makes a covenant with David. And let me go back to that term. Right? God called Abraham and made a covenant, a promise, a contract with Abraham to make him a great nation. He made a covenant with Moses, which is, I'm going to give you the law. You guys are going to obey it. And if you obey it, I will bless you. And he makes a covenant with David, a promise to say, your descendant will rule over the world forever. Okay, this is a very messianic promise of a Messiah, a covenant with David. But the people do not keep God's covenant. They do not keep their end of the bargain. They don't keep the law of Moses. And in 500, after a bunch of really awful kings, it's not exactly 500. I think it's 586. I have to go back and check that date. But the people are exiled. You don't need to know the date. But the people are taken from their land and carted off into Babylon and exiled. You guys may know from, the story of Daniel. As you see on the bottom line here, I have David's time. Right after David, there was the building of the temple. But it's in the time of exile. The temple gets destroyed. This is the time of the prophets. Many of the prophets are saying it's going to happen. There's going to be an exile. There's going to be a destruction of the temple. That's what Jeremiah is mainly about. And then some of the prophets are even after exile, like Daniel, talking about people coming back into the land. So eventually people do begin to come back and they rebuild the temple, and you have a second temple. And so by the time of Jesus, the temple has been rebuilt. So there's just kind of a basic chronology. If you're kind of wondering when things happen, this can kind of help you. Is it before David? Is it before Moses? Is it before, is it after the exile? This will really help you kind of understand the basic chronology of the Bible. Take some notes on it. Make sure you write that down, and hopefully it'll be helpful. It's helped me a lot to understand kind of the timeline of the Bible. Okay, see ya.